Good evening for those joining us online from the Asia Pac. We just said bye to you for the last hour, but we are not done yet. We still have a participant and contributor in this session. Saket is joining from India. We have Stefano from Italy. We have David, Tom, and Julius joining from the US and led very well and capable hands of our friend Dave Willox. Well, this is a very important topic, and we wanted to squeeze it into yesterday, but I thought it really deserved its own hour. It could probably be a conference in itself. In fact, we're going to have probably half a day of this at the American Petroleum Institute API conference on cybersecurity in 2 weeks from now. But supply chain security and third-party risk are extremely essential and important for organizations, and important for not only for large organizations but also small and also organizations that are global in nature. One of the things that I really get asked all the time is that how are small businesses as important as large businesses, and the security that cuts across is as essential for them. Well, look at your supply chain. Whether you are a large organization or small, you don't perform and you don't go to business alone. You work with other collaborators, suppliers, and third parties that actually come together to deliver what you deliver for business that you do and you are in. Whether you're a bank or a utility provider, or running probably the largest rail network in the US, just as Julius does, the longest in Dallas, and everything is big in Texas. You'll talk about it. But you do have a responsibility to look at your supply chain and the risk. So I would leave it to the capable hands of my good friend and brother Dave Willox to moderate this session of really great contributors here, and we'll come back to close the hour with some takeaways. I urge you to think through the entirety of this premise, and this hour is yours. Take it away, Dave.
Val, thank you so much, my brother and friend, and it's great to be here. And thanks to you and the team for putting this organization and this event together virtually this way. You're really taking advantage of innovation, and I couldn't think of a better and more important topic to use this for. We do have a Q&A, panel on the side for all of the viewers across the world. If you do have any questions that come up, we have amazing esteemed experts with us today. Please feel free, and I will try to scan those as we're going through the discussion. Now, one of the things I wanted to bring up, we call this third-party supply chain risk and third-party vendor risk, and it doesn't sound that scary when you use those terms. And really, the consequences of the supply chain risk and third-party risk are extremely important, devastating, and could be a disabling to your organization. And they complicate and could compromise personal privacy, national security, and everything that they tie to. We're so all interconnected. But this conversation we're having today is, or should I say, should be going on all around the world in all industry sectors right now. From the entrepreneurs, as Val mentioned earlier, working on the latest startups, the manufacturers rolling out the next Internet of Things devices, to the enterprise C-suites, all the way to the United States Congress, where just last month they were presented with the results of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, and that's been talked about throughout the commission in different panels, that concluded a detailed study highlighting immediate and long-term threats to third-party risk in our supply chain, and the dire consequences. And if you want to read some scary report recommendations and research, you can open that and read some. But the dire consequences to our national security if ignored. And it may not apply to your unique industry at this point, but these regulations and research and recommendations are being made across industries through all different organizations in the government. Tom Patterson earlier in the summit recognized the White House Cyber Moonshot Project, which made again recommendations to the to the executive branch for reform and for regulatory updating. These reports were made to educate the policymakers to the size and scale of the threats, and I think they were very effective because we're starting to see these regulations evolve and become law as we move forward. And some are becoming best practices now and being adopted as best practices in industries, which I think is one of the recommendations that we're making as an organization, but at least to pay attention to them and know where your risks lie. So as Val mentioned, from the endpoint sensors, the explosion that's going to be taking place through 5G, complex robotics, making our personal lives easier, enterprise operations more efficient, cyber supply chain security is opening our eyes to these vulnerabilities. And another component which we can't forget is the human component. And this is an old risk, but one of the most impactful, with new implications complicating the dynamic with complex personal privacy and legal protections in being able to cover that risk from our corporate perspective. So we're going to talk to industry leadership dealing with this from a security level for their organizations, and we're also going to talk to some of the developers and companies that are evolving to solve these problems for the organizations and address these needs so that they can begin to fortify their basis from a third party and supply risk perspective. And then we'll also hear some academic views and some international perspectives on how this is being addressed internationally. And we all have to be aware of these. That's why this community is so important for us, because we all are all interconnected, and what we're doing today in the US is impacting what we're doing and how we're working with the EU and throughout the world. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. Thank you all. It's wonderful to have you here, and thank you so much for taking your time to participate in this community. The first I would like to introduce is, and I'll just start at the top of the screen, Stefano Zanero from Politecnico di Milano. Okay. And Stefano is a cybersecurity professor in the computer architecture group, which focuses on cybersecurity that impacts IoT, automotive, financial malware. Stefano has a great understanding with what's happening in the EU from a regulatory or best practices perspective, and we'll hear more from Stefano soon. Next, Julius Smith, one of my neighbors here in Dallas. Great to see you, Julius. Julius is the Cso of Dart. That's a Dallas Area Rapid Transportation. I think I got the acronym right. And Julius, we thank you and for being here and for your attention to security as you're protecting the souls of so many Dallas travelers. So thank you. Next is Saket Modi. Saket, I believe, is on the West Coast joining us.
I'm based in Palo Alto, Dave.
In Palo Alto. Okay, Saket, nice to see you. Thank you, the CEO of Lucidius Technology. Lucidius is an innovative enterprise-wide risk management platform that offers real-time visibility across the organization using machine learning as it monitors people, processes, and technology, while delivering not just a risk score, but also prioritized actionable insights, which takes it to the next level. And to the next guest, David Stender. David, thank you so much for joining us. This is one of the most critical areas of our industry that's impacted by third-party risk, and it impacts us all, but also impacts our economy and our standing in the world. David is the CSO of M&T Bank, where he oversees all security aspects, not just physical security, executive security protections, but cybersecurity, of course, privacy, fraud, and third-party risk. It's a big area to cover, but I expect they're all interconnected in a way and have a cyber thread that weaves through them. So, David, thank you so much. We look forward to hearing more from your perspective as well. And I'll start off, and just so happens that we're in the order that I wanted to begin the conversation. And Stefano, that's with you from Polytechnico, and how you're seeing this as you're overseeing IoT and the thought leadership and recommendations coming out of the EU, which impact all of us. Would you mind sharing a bit more about who you are, as I'm sure I didn't cover anything or everything properly, but please give an overview and tell us how you're looking at supply chain and some of the recommendations you can make, and also some of the risks that we're facing in that area.
Sure. So thanks a lot for the invitation. My role at Polytechnico is leading the cybersecurity group, and as you were mentioning, the most relevant area that we are working on for this panel is cyber physical system security. In particular, we look at automotive, robotics, devices that have huge safety and security issues. And in those areas, you can see the supply chain problem at its fullest, because they are, of course, on the one side, you see the supply chain problem in the parts and the different types of software that are integrated in a single car, for instance, or even in a single large-scale robot. On the other side, for robotics and for automation of factories, you can see the upstream risk in supply chain from the fact that a cyber attack on your supplier can create a critical issue with your own company. So companies, at least in Italy, this is an issue that has been there for a very long time, because Italian companies tend to be very small, and usually you have like a collection of 20 companies that are what in a more sensible nation would be a single large company. And instead in Italy are different chunks of a productive process. We call those industrial districts. And that's super typical. So we always had this issue where you had a chain of companies that are actually bound together. If one fails, all of the others suffer. And this is something that is that has entered the world with the new global dimension of production. We have seen it impact, for instance, now all of the supply chains that are that have a link in China during the first phase of the COVID impact. So there's a lot of ways that third-party risk affects us. Specifically for the security engineering part, there's the problem of how to ensure the security of a composed system. And this is an enormous, gigantic problem. And I have seen it in the automotive industry. I must confess that before becoming a professor, I did the same thing that Saket has done, founding a company that does penetration testing here in Italy. So I have seen this from kind of both sides of academic and of the academic side and the more hackish side. And the issue with automotive security is at the same time very simple and very complex. The OEMs, the manufacturer of vehicles, want to receive from their tier ones and tier twos parts that are secure. They want to offload this problem to their suppliers. And this cannot happen, because unless their suppliers are designing the entire network of their vehicles, which happens for very, very few manufacturers and very, very few tier ones, they cannot do that. And we all know it, because in computer engineering, we know that the system as a whole is more than the sum of the different components. And we have been doing testing on the whole systems for a very long time. There is an entire industry that Saket is probably going to talk more about afterwards, but there's an entire industry built around it. And OEMs have very grudgingly accepted that they were responsible for testing the vehicle as a whole after their suppliers had sent them the different components. And this is happening throughout much less regulated and much less scrutinized areas in the whole of the IoT market. And this is the reason why, at least for instance, the European Union has tried to approach this by creating an optional but recommended set of security certification standards. And here I must point out that I'm talking in my personal capacity, for my personal point of view, because I am part of the steering committee that advises the European Commission on that. So this is purely my personal point of view. But the idea there is that if you impose even lightweight security certification standards in a very similar vein to the standards, for instance, for electric safety, you can, starting from the final product, since you imply analyzing the security of the different components that end up in your product, if it's produced or manufactured in the EU or sold in the EU, you can create a network effect that basically makes at least a baseline of security standards and of analysis of the of how the security of the composite system stems from the different components. You can begin to introduce that in the market, because in many areas there are regulations, as you were pointing out, even throughout the different countries they are different, but they more or less point in the same directions. But for some areas, such as the general, off-the-shelf IoT, there's little to no regulation on that, and there's little to no pressure on vendors and on manufacturers to actually build security in, because there's no loop, right? You as the consumer has no way to know if what they are buying has some security properties. They just kind of expect it, but they don't know really, and so there cannot be any feedback loop. And this is very similar to the problem of safety of cars. Before there was a regulation at some point, and there was also market recognition. So some of the safety equipment on the cars were required by the buyers before being mandated, such as ABS. So we are kind of in that same position with trying to on part regulate and on part make the market regulate supply chain security. And it's a very to use the words of what I'm told is an old Jewish curse. It's a very interesting situation to be in.
Yes, Stefano, thank you very much. A great overview, and very concerning the consequences if we don't try to get ahead of ourselves in this process. We've seen what happens when we don't get in front of this and of issues and let technology drive our decisions rather than their safety and security consequences. I want to stop for just one quick second. I was remiss to introduce Tom Miller. Sorry, I'm so sorry, Tom. Tom's actually a friend as well, and a person, someone I work with outside of this panel. And so I will be hearing about this again. If we were on stage, this wouldn't have happened. You were actually covered by my notes on the screen as I was chatting, Tom. So I apologize. But Tom is the CEO. Tom is a experienced founder, leader in the risk analytics space, has founded and exited several technology companies. Currently, Tom is the CEO of ClearForce Technologies. They're a leading enterprise edge company that focuses on the human risk side of the supply chain, continuously monitoring for unique risk factors to proactively prevent loss or disruption while maintaining, most importantly, that privacy and regulatory standards, and being able to proactively prevent incidents, but doing that in a regulatory, privacy-concentric environment. So thanks so much, Tom. So sorry about that, and we'll definitely look forward to hearing more from you as we continue the conversation. I know you have a lot to share. But first, I'd like to David Stender. I'd like to come to your area. You're focused on third-party supply chain at the financial level, from a institutional enterprise perspective, but also a banking, which is such a security focused industry, and you're facing the third party risk. What, David, if you wouldn't mind sharing, what are the consequences of not focusing on some of these new risks? How are you, and then how are you internally thinking about your supply chain and how to protect it?
Thanks for that question. I can tell you that third-party risk from a regulatory perspective in financial services is one of the more heavily regulated groups within the 16 critical infrastructure sections within the United States. Third-party risk is always in the top three, cybersecurity being in that top three too. And remember, third-party risk and supply chain have more than just a cybersecurity aspect to it. A much larger, even a straight operational aspect. If you can't get the parts that you need to manufacture X, Y, or Z widget, then you're not going to be able to make that product. It's a really big issue, and I think it has only gotten worse and will only continue to get worse as time goes on. 20 years ago, very few embedded computer capabilities, very limited security aspects. You mostly had to deal with fake stuff. Cisco was famous for having as much as 10% of their product as it was shipped in shrink wrap, whatever that particular product was, being some type of false product, right? A copy, a knockoff. That has only gotten much, much worse. Every single thing you look at these days has some form of computer in it, everything from your watch to a car. And I think it's an area that has only also been exacerbated by coronavirus. If you look at it, when you had everyone working in your office and you had that sort of in a tightly controlled perimeter, for lack of a better term, it helped to limit that risk. Now, my company has about 18,000 employees. I've got 18,000 third-party service providers all of a sudden because they are in environments that I don't understand. I can't go to everybody's house and check out to make sure that their home system is set up properly. I don't know what's in the background. I don't know whether or not they think they're providing a secure service, but in fact, something bad is happening there. And it's little things like that that have changed the face of the risk associated with this. If you look at a company like mine, we have, like most financial services company, and we're a pretty big company, we do much of the work ourselves, but we also have to outsource a tremendous amount of the work that goes on. And like most things, when you outsource work of whatever sort, whether that's a payment processor or a third-party developer, or you pick whatever that service is, even Brink's moving money around from bank to bank, that work can be outsourced, but the risk can't. And that just adds more emphasis to the importance of having a good third-party risk management program and why you need that in place, and it has to be strong. Because at the end of the day, you mentioned when you were talking about my bio a little bit, I oversee all security at our bank. And the reason why is because from a customer's perspective, they don't care whether their money was stolen through a physical bank robbery or whether the bank was hacked into and they lost money that way, or whether it was a fraud perpetrated by some nefarious actor. To them, it's the bank's fault, right?
Yeah.
So from a customer's perspective, security is security. And so third-party risk is really my risk, and I have to look at it that way. I can't outsource that risk at all. So I have to integrate them into my larger security program, and they become just another aspect of security. Now, I will tell you, if there is any area in security that keeps me up, it is third-party risk, because it's the area over which I have probably the most exposure and I have the least amount of control.
No, thank you so much, David. And you're right. The financial institutions were built on trust, savings and trust. And that trust in the public is something that is in your hands right now. And saying that that's a area, that third-party risk that keeps you up at night, shares the level of attention that we should all be placing on this. Thank you so much for that overview. Next, I'd like to speak again at the industrial, institutional level, and Julius, come to you from a organization that protects humans and has to maintain that trust again in the public. How are you protecting and preventing third-party risk and third-party safety and security concerns.
Hi, Dave. Good question. Thank you. And I'd like to everyone else in the supply chain and vendor risk management in transit and transportation is continuing to grow at a rapid pace. And the change is affecting all of us across the transit industry. And, now we have to secure an expanded edge in transit because of we have thousands of folks working remote at transit organizations. And then we have the hybrid situation with still operating vehicles. And the vehicles themselves are it's a technology vehicle. We have all types of technology from cameras to Wi-Fi to tablets to system checking. Many of it is cloud-based. And so we have several outsourced and vendors that we partner with. And in these relationships, much like David had just mentioned, that is a big area that keeps me up at night too, because of their control. And so some of the things that we're doing and that we have to do is think about the impact on the customer, and then also internally, because we have payment systems, ticket vending machines, mobile app payments, et cetera, and internally the systems that we have, from your traditional IT to your operational technology like SCADA systems and industrial control systems. So it is a wide range of areas. So we are starting to, we've started this a few years ago to really manage and work with the procurement process. The procurement process up front to incorporate the needs related to cybersecurity when we need to outsource to a third-party vendor, to ensure that we put the expectations for cybersecurity in the RFP or the statement of work, and then work with the appropriate vendor to ensure, as best we can, ensure that they are meeting those requirements. So it's evolving. We are constantly concerned about the disruption to the system, and also disruption to the supply chain. Supply chain meaning the vendors that supply parts to mechanics that fix the vehicles. And then so there's limited control, and this is a worldwide supply chain that we are working with. So it's evolving every single day, Dave, and it's constant work, and there's no rest in this area in particular.
Julius, I don't envy the weight that you carry in this area, because I know it's all comes down to the safety and security of your passengers and the public. And I thank you for bearing that for all of us, and sharing how complex your ecosystem is, and David as well highlighted that you have to be able to look at from a high view, and then start drilling in and understanding exactly where the components of that ecosystem are vulnerable, and how to approach those, and help you in those processes. I know that Saket and Tom been listening closely to all three of the first panelists as they're addressing for these, and looking at ways to help automate and find processes to mitigate these risks. So Saket, I'll come to you next, and if you can share why are we and what motivated you to create a solution for this, and what risks and opportunities can industries and security leaders take to help prevent future threats?
Certainly, Dave. And again, that's a great question. And thank you, CFS, for arranging this panel. It's an honor to be a part of this panel. Before I jump into the solution of, what do I think about third-party security, I just want to take a minute and give you a perspective what I think about third parties. I feel that there is a traditional way of doing business on how you think of first parties, third parties, fourth parties. I think today that's completely got disrupted. Because if we keep thinking about first party and third party and fourth parties, We don't really understand. That doesn't really account for the AWS and the Azures of the world, where you no longer are in control of your own data. It actually is their data center or their cloud, or the SaaS applications, right, where you don't even know, where you can write a command on a terminal and really understand where is the data being stored, what is the partition, what's the security, etc., right? So I think we're moving towards a world where the way in our physical infrastructure, when it comes to technology, I think a very large extent of large Fortune 2000 companies have started embracing the zero trust model, where there is no outside and inside network. Exactly in the same way, I feel for third parties, as you move into the near future, this boundary between being, oh, you're a third party and I'm a first party, at least from those places where you're transacting through APIs, because we're all going towards an API, explosion, right? I think that's gonna really dissolve. And the reason I'm saying this is that this is a very important point of view of being able to monitor third-party risk. I think traditionally, if you look at cyber risks or third-party cyber risk management, they've really happened in two big waves. The first wave has been the Archers and the Process Unities of the world, where you give out a long questionnaire and basically send that to your third party, expect them to fill that in, and basis on what they reply, you say, okay, can I work with this third party, because this risk is an acceptable risk when I'm starting to work with that third party. But that's a problem, right? I mean, you today, with over a couple of thousand vulnerabilities being reported on a daily basis, you cannot have a one-time questionnaire based assessment to really go ahead and do an assessment of your third parties. There was a second wave of third-party assessments, if you know about what Gartner calls the SRS tools, which is Security Rating Services tools. That's where the BitSights and the security scorecards and the risk recons of the world comes into the picture. I think they were extremely useful. In fact, Dave, you used a very interesting word before, asking me to speak, that you're automating some degree of, third-party risk assessment. I think there was a second wave where, it was a very good automated way, which was a little thing added or complementing the questionnaires, where you give the primary domain name of the third party that you've got. In the case of David, if you've got thousands of third parties, he'll give thousands of primary domains. And based on those primary domains, you have an outside-in scan of the DNS, SPF record, DKIM records, and leaked credentials, etc., and then you get a score for every single third party. Now, I think it's a good posture assessment you can do from the outside, but unfortunately, it's only scratching the surface, because if you're talking to a third party which you're taking and giving APIs to, you're storing your data, we're actually interacting with their team and working with them, an SRS tool will not actually solve the problem. And that's where, Dave, since you asked me, then, how do we look at solving the problem? We actually help various companies. And I'll give an actual example. This is a Fortune 100 company, which has a couple of thousand third parties. Now, what we provide is actually this continuous risk rating for every single laptop, for every IP address, for every API. So what happens is, every time a contractor is trying to connect to your network, you define the list of parameters, like the antivirus needs to be enabled and updated, the operating system needs to be updated, the local firewall is updated, etc., It can be 100 parameters you define, which is dynamically checked on a daily basis. And then you put that together, give a simple score of how secured is the laptop. And then only if the score is above a particular threshold, it is allowed to come in through your NAC or through your VPN. So that just becomes a new age way in which dynamically, automatically, every single system which joins your network gets screened for controls that you've defined as your policies. And then basis on that, you're sure that whatever's joining in, it is really, really secure. So that's like, in a way, you can call it a third wave, which only complements the questionnaires and the SRS. But the way it was outside in and questionnaire based, this is inside out assessment of third parties. And that's what we've been doing, Dave. And that's what we've seen a very, very high uptick in terms of demand. Because as Dave said, that's the number one thing that CISOs and CIOs around the world are really, really worried about. Over to you, Dave.
Yeah, Saket, thanks so much. And what you're doing at Lucidius sounds extremely valuable and important to the industries, and definitely could ask more, but I'm only limited by time here. So hopefully everyone will stay connected, and the CFF audience will reach out to all of our panelists. Tom, I'd like to come to you next, as you're addressing for solutions as well. In your case, you're focused more on, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but focused more primarily on the human component of the supply chain. Another very complex component because of its individual nature. It's a living, person that you're securing, and there are a lot of personal protections, privacy concerns, institutional, big brother concerns on how individuals feel about being monitored continuously. But we all recognize, as we've seen threats evolve and unpeel them and seen where those threats ultimately start, that the human component is one of the most critical to deal with. So if you wouldn't mind sharing more about ClearForce and how you're doing that, and how you're seeing this grow, and addressing the regulatory and concerns of the future.
Yeah, no, thanks, Dave. And again, thanks for the opportunity to comment here. Yeah, so as you mentioned, our focus is on the human side of the problem and the risk associated with it, and really trying to get to as far left into the motivational factors that create a lot of the risk. Again, whether it's third party or first party. And I think as David mentioned earlier, third party is a challenge because you just have less, right, about the individuals themselves, and one of the challenges along those lines is just the connectiveness, or the for employees. You have an opportunity more times than not to know the individual. Today, obviously in COVID, you're not necessarily in the office together with them, but there's a bonding and a relationship that's different on the employee level. There's a level of loyalty into the organization. There's a level of connectiveness into the mission. And when you start to remove that and you start to go down that third party path, it just doesn't exist in the same way. And I think from a human capital risk perspective, that just heightens some of the issues that you're going to deal with. And we see that a lot, right? So if you're comparing almost at any time, you can start with like a 1099 contractor population as part of that supply chain. Fundamentally, you're going to find greater pockets of risk in a contractor population than you will with the employee base. Like, we'll work with organizations in all kinds of industries, even evaluating criminal activity, right? So in a professional organization, a white collar business, a private sector company, you're going to have some level of criminal activity that's going to occur within the workforce all the time. When you start to move that out to, again, a 1099 population, now all of a sudden, what we see typically is that could be 2, 3, or 4x, the issues that you would tend to find inside. And a lot of times organizations may be blind to that. They may not constantly be looking for it. It may be difficult for them to uncover. But that risk is real and it exists. I think the other thing is you have, if you then move on from 1099, and has been discussed here in the panel, I think a lot of the supply chain third party focuses on, whether it's the questionnaires that were mentioned, focus on the company. And, what we find as well is the integrity of the individuals that either own those companies or managing, controlling C-suite executives in those business. If you have a breakdown in the integrity on the people side, you got higher risk on the company side. And we've seen that in different cases as well. We did, maybe an example is we did a bunch of work in the small business PPP fraud space, right? And in that case, you're identifying like verified felons that are owning or controlling an organization. Like we're finding significant fraud in those spaces. And again, that's a direct correlation between integrity of the individuals owning and controlling and risk of the business. We've seen it on the merchant side. We've seen it in the lending side. Another example would be, 3 to 4 times the credit losses in lending to merchants where you have some level of criminal activity or misconduct occurring, right? So the people piece is real. And I'll kind of end on another point, which may be a little bit less obvious, and that goes inside, right? So for the employees that have direct contact with any supply chain contacts, with vendors, et cetera, if you have employees that are under severe compounding pressure and stress and you're not aware of it, that in itself creates issues, right? So you may have trained your employees on all the proper cyber hygiene and guidelines, but if you have folks that are simply distracted and overwhelmed with the stress of their life or their particular situation, obviously we're all under a lot of stress this year in different ways, that creates a distraction. Those distractions create mistakes. Those mistakes create organizational risk. It also creates individuals that could be vulnerable to vendor contacts, supply chain contacts that could put them in a position to do things that they normally wouldn't do. But from a personal perspective, they're in a tough spot, and that vulnerability is creating organizational risk.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. The human component is so complex. I wanted to ask one quick question because I want to lead this into Stefano next to discuss some of the things that are happening on the EU end from a regulatory best practices side. How is technology enabling an ability to look at the human component at scale when addressing privacy and personal concerns? Because if I'm an employer, I don't want my employees to feel like I'm overly monitoring every aspect of their life and looking at everything every social media post that they make and every background check that on a regular basis. How can technology handle that concern? Tom, that was for you to answer how you're dealing with that, because it sounds like that would be a big concern of yours, and then I wanted to take that to Stefano.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's the opportunity and the role for technology, right? So I think that technology enables organizations to be able to lock down and set guardrails so that you are ensuring that you're protecting privacy, you're protecting civil liberties of the individual. You're using technology capability, whether that's anonymity or automated checks and balances in a process, audit functionality. There's a lot of ways that when you move it away, again, this is the people side of it. If you can put those guardrails in place for organizations, I think that becomes critical. And whether that's FCRA or CCPA or GDPR or whatever the legal requirements and regulations are, super important that organizations, when building these programs, have that in mind right from the start, and it becomes foundational in the way they establish security programs.
Thank you, and I'll go right to you, Stefano. On the EU side, where we know there are many privacy concerns, and you take that very seriously as an entity, a leadership and organization and political basis. How are the EU rolling out best practices and recommendations to address these concerns and maintain those same liberties and protections?
Sure. So there are two sides to the regulatory framework there. On one side, there is the GDPR side that that has been impactful all over the world. So probably that's the most known area outside the US, outside the EU, and also in the US. The GDPR already contains a number of provisions related to third-party risk and how the data controllers need to ensure that third parties involved in data treatment adhere to certain regulations. This, for instance, applies also to all of the issues related to using cloud services. For instance, there's a certain set of regulations that apply to that. This is one area. It's the best known area, so I will leave it aside for a moment because that's already impacted throughout the industries, and it's probably already, most people are probably already aware of those. The other area is the area of security regulations instead, and which was spearheaded by the NIS directive, which is the directive on network and information security, which applies mostly in the member states. But then there is the Cybersecurity Act, which throughout the certification framework that I was mentioning before will probably apply as a ripple effect also outside the EU. And the certification implied by the Cybersecurity Act is a voluntary scheme, but the idea is that these would become like a quality brand for certain products and services, so that it would create a positive effect, much like the adoption of quality certification standards such as ISO 9001 that has become prevalent, not because it was mandated by law, but because people started to recognize it as a quality item, right? So the idea there is to create throughout industry verticals, and in order to make these not extraordinarily difficult to follow, to have the industry stakeholders themselves kind of self-regulate, create their own certification framework. The most advanced one is for the provision of cloud services, for instance, and this could be published for comments relatively soon. The idea is to have this set of lightweight certification schemes that are created by industry bodies, by the stakeholders themselves, and that are applied in the common market. And there's also a provision of some stronger certification schemes instead for for critical types of infrastructures. So there is a separate thing that comes after the Cybersecurity Act for medical devices, and there's a separate scheme for telecommunications, for the whole 5G networks brouhaha that we probably don't want to enter. So there are a number of regulatory acts that try to push, in some cases with a real validation from governmental institutions, and in other cases as circuits of certification that are supported by the institutions, but really left to the industry to sort out by themselves. And I don't know. Of course, the approach from the European side and the American side is quite different on this subject. But I think it's an interesting approach to try to create that positive feedback loop that otherwise does not start because consumers are unable to assess the security and the privacy compliance of many of the services that they use.
Yeah, thank you very much. And the EU has been very forward-thinking here, as the US has been in these areas, and really addressing it with full attention now, and concern and diligence. From and Saket, we're tight on time now. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try to get a few more. I'd like to get Saket, you, Julius, and David in with a couple more comments in just a few minutes, if we can keep them concise. First, Saket, for you, I'd like to hear how your tool is helping organizations maintain the potential regulatory best practices that you're seeing coming down the pipe, as we're seeing more and more organizations will be focusing on this. How are you doing that? And then for Julius and David to be thinking about it, I'd like to talk about, from your perspective and speaking to the community here of cyber experts, cybersecurity experts. What can you share with the cybersecurity experts that they should be thinking about and working on to help improve your work, your organizations on a daily basis? Saket, we can start with how you're helping with the regulatory.
Certainly, Dave. In fact, I think the premise of frameworks or the controls that we make in our product or in most products that you would find always start with the regulatory framework. So whether it's the C2M2 or the NIST CSF or SP 853 or any of these popular compliances and regulations which are out there, whether they're in geography specific, industry specific, I can tell you that in fact, I was just talking to one of my customers, a Fortune 50 company, and their CIO was telling me that, and I was pleasantly surprised that last year he spent almost 50% of his time with regulators, because every state is now coming out with a new cybersecurity privacy policy and all of that. And what he's saying that, look, I have to have the least common denominator of everything, and then have it together. So the point I'm making there is that my product or most products, I think they start from the regulations. They have to. However, the slightly advanced use case, because regulations you have to follow. There's no two ways about it, right? But I actually see difference in CISOs and CIOs and even chief risk officers, which now say that, look, regulations are good, but that's not the only thing that we want. They're now going to something like the MITRE framework of the attack framework, which is out there, where you've got the tactics and the techniques of how does a hacker really operate. I have a lot of places where we actually help companies with say, you know what, I don't want to see my regulation thing only, or I don't care about my scores of how secured we are. All I care about that in my industry, my geography, and my size, these are the top 5 types of cyber insurance claims that have come, which in other words means these are the top 10 risk areas for a company of my shape, size, and industry and geography. And you know what? Just tell me the likelihood of a ransomware breach. Tell me the likelihood of a business email compromise, or my customer's PII or a PHI data if I'm a hospital, that being compromised. So that is really morphing into things which are more tangible, objective, and most importantly, something that the board and the CEO can consume, and not just something which is, a tick in the box that, you know what, I'm done with my regulation, because 92% of financial services companies hacked in the last 5 years have been all compliant with every compliance standard out there, but still they get hacked. So that's where my tool operates, and that's exactly the sweet spot of where we are out there, Dave, and that's where. Over to you, Dave.
Okay, thanks, Saket, and I thank you for being a tool to help our organizations be proactive rather than reactive in these issues, because that's where we're going to help reduce the losses and protect all of our concerns. Julius, if you wouldn't mind sharing, you have a large audience here of cybersecurity leadership, many working on the solutions and the problems, many currently embedded with institutions like yourselves today. What can you share with our community to help them better address the needs that you're seeing and help your concerns?
The supply chain and risk management curve is constantly going, as we already talked about. So the strategy, it encompasses a lot of different areas and a lot of different partnerships to make it work. We're talking about the people, the processes, and the technology all coming together. And then so we try to get away from, we've talked about third parties, but we try to focus more on the partner piece of it and communicate with them as a partner for the same goal, and that's safe and secure systems. So in that strategy, just to highlight a few areas, we're looking to make sure that we protect the customer, the operational impact, and the brand influence as well. And then also in these agreements, we have a set time to terminate an agreement or the work has been done. But often we see the closure of it and the data that has been accessed or possessed by the partner, they still have it. They still have access to it. So the agreements need to target how that data will be either sanitized, given back, et cetera, with documentation. So it's a continuous process, continuous monitoring, and continuous reporting. And so we have also audits, constant audits from our internal auditor and external. They bring in external auditors as well, and a requirement for our partners to be audited for safe and secure practices.
Yeah, well, thank you, Julius, and that's it's inspiring to hear how aggressive you are in your approach and tactics when it comes to a industry as important as transportation. We thank you for that. And David, to the same extent, there probably would be some overlapping. So please share how this impacts your industry. But if there's anything else you feel that we've missed here that would be important to this audience, please jump in and offer your leadership.
So Saket and Julius covered exactly what I was going to say. You know, if you look at financial services, just about everybody that's been hit has met the regulatory requirements, and they sort of follow all the good and best industry practices. There's really three aspects to this, and that third one will touch on what Tom talked about. That first of meeting the table stakes. Is this a company I can do business with, right? That's the regulatory aspect. Have you met sort of the bottom line general stuff? Then there's sort of a technology aspect. Have you looked at their systems and do they meet the same general security goals and desires that we meet within our own systems? But that key thing that I think is often missing is that relationship portion later on, where you talk about the human element and what the sort of culture of that company is that you're working with, and whether or not they're a company that you think you can trust and do business with. I can tell you all the companies, and I've done more than 200 third-party risk assessments myself for our most critical companies. It's a lot. I did it when I ran for the IRS. I do it for our most critical ones at the bank now. All that stuff up front, the tabletop, or excuse me, the desktop reviews of their policies, all that stuff is great. It has to be done. But I get more out of an hour sitting down with the CEO of the company and talking about their culture and just walking through their ops floor and seeing how their folks react. I can tell you whether that company is a company that I think is going to be a secure one, is going to be helpful and part of our solution, or will add to the problem.
Thank you very much. And yes, it often does come back to humans who are building and running these systems and employing their own best practices when it comes to third-party risk. Getting away from the humans for a moment, the components that go into all of it, and we just have another couple of minutes, so I'm going to take it back to Stefano from a global perspective to wrap this up. But how far down the food chain do we have to go from third-party risk management? Third parties are employing IoT devices, systems of systems. They're building technologies, buying components for their devices that are being deployed that could potentially possess malware. How far does this go? It's almost like going down a rabbit hole into where did you buy that chip that was used to make that sensor for a larger component? Where do we manage all of that?
Well, security is always a rabbit hole, right? If you look, you will always find something deeper. And what we do as sensible security analysts is to draw a trust boundary beyond which the attacks are out of our scope. So it's different if you are building an IoT device that ends up on a shelf in a house, or if you are building the guidance system for a missile. So it's a matter of modeling the threat that your devices and your product is going to be subject to, and depending on that sensible threat model, to draw a boundary as to how deep an attacker could conceivably go. That's traditional threat modeling and risk assessment that you cannot do perfect. You need to do good enough. So.
Thank you. Well, obviously, this is a very complex problem that's being dealt with from a variety of perspectives. And everyone here, I thank you so much for being part of this discussion. You were all instrumental in, I hope, giving our audience a better sense for how they can personally engage from the solutions as well as from the risk and security side in putting the policies in place to address the issues that are at hand. So I will say thank you all very much. We're wrapping up here right about on time, and thank you to everyone in the CFF community. Thank you, Val, and I'm sure others will have more questions, and I know that our panel are open to further feedback to this debate. So thank you for all of your leadership. I've learned a lot, and I know everyone in the community did. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Please
All right,
stay
thank
safe
you.
Thanks, everyone.
through these challenging times. Take care.
Right. Have a good one. Thank you.
Thank you. You too.